when I woke up, very confused. She said, "You almost died last night. In fact, no one can believe you were alive."
I went into the games not knowing what was coming.
As humans, we just hate uncertainty.
You just sensed that it was out there.
You have to start somewhere.
We're all programmed to push ourselves even farther.
This is On the X, an Ironclad original. Welcome to On the X. I'm Chris Irwin, and today my guest is Ben Milligan. Ben is a former Navy SEAL, a historian, and the author of By Water Beneath the Walls, The Rise of the Navy SEALs, which tells the history of the SEALs from World War II through Vietnam, and seeks to answer the question of how a naval unit became one of the world's most preeminent direct action special operations forces on land. Ben also speaks about leadership, organizational change, and American military history to audiences ranging from the country's most elite military units to students at Yale University. In 2022, he was selected by the National World War II Museum to lead a tour of the D-Day battlefields in Normandy, showcasing his expertise in historical storytelling and strategic leadership. I learned so much about naval special warfare in his book that I never knew, and it was great to get additional insights during our conversation. So here we go with Ben Milligan on the X. Of all the people, and not that it's that many at this point, but a few dozen, I would think, at this point that I've talked to on this podcast, this is the one I've had to research the most. And the funny part is, usually I'm researching about the guest for the most part, and a lot of times they've written books or whatever. This time I'm like having to research the subject of the book a ton and make sure I'm read up as much on this stuff, because honestly, I think like a lot of guys from the community, like there's so much of this that I didn't know. There's sort of the highlights and the kind of, we came out of this and we came from the NCDUs and the UDTs and the Scouts and Raiders, and the names are familiar, but man, so many of the details were just things that I didn't know. So let's just start, like, at what point did this question, right? And the theme of this is, as you say in the beginning, hey, there's lots of SEAL books out there. This isn't a whiz-bang, shoot-'em-up kind of glory telling of you personally at all. It is not anything even really all that recent in the SEAL teams, right? It goes through Vietnam, basically. But it is trying to answer this question of, why is it that a naval unit has become one of the best, if not the best, kind of land-based direct action special operations force on the planet. So at what point did you think, I want to write a book about that?
I didn't think that I would write a book about the SEAL teams until after I decided I wanted to write a book. So the idea for writing a history book had been in my head for a long time, at least since college. I'd always kind of thought, this is something that I would do, but I didn't know. And when I got out of the SEAL teams and I was starting to, get into, civilian jobs and things like that, I thought the last book that I would ever write would be a history of the SEAL teams. It wasn't until 2011 that this idea sort of not only became an idea that I thought, could be interesting, it became an idea that I thought, or it became a question that I thought I really did have to answer. And in 2011, there was two major things that happened. One, SEALs killed the arch villain in the war on terror, Osama bin Laden, and 3 months after that, SEALs go down in the Extortion 17 helicopter. Largest loss of life for coalition forces in the entire war in Afghanistan. So you have these two, major events in the entire, war on terror. Both of them involve SEALs, and both of these events occur more than 600 miles away from the closest salt water.
Right.
That seemed to me remarkable. And it wasn't just remarkable, I think it wasn't just a question I thought that the SEALs needed to answer. It was a question that I needed to answer for me, because, I think we all came out of our service wondering, things about, this institution. It's like questions that you might have about your family. Where did our family come from? And we all hit a point, in our lives where we start to think, you start to think those sort of introspective questions. You want to know about you. You want to know, where did I come from? That's why we take trips to Ireland when we turn 40 and things like that. So this was important for me to kind of understand, where I came from with this institution that was monumentally important in my own life, but also in my personal life. The book or the person that I dedicated the book to is my grandfather. He was a World War II Marine, and after the Battle of Okinawa, he volunteered to join the UDTs. So it was a kind of a lost bit of family lore, but it was interesting, and I wanted to know how that happened. I mean, how does a Marine join the underwater demolition teams? So I just went looking.
Yeah. And where did you start?
I started, with the books that were out there. And I didn't know that I was going to write this. I didn't know that this was going to be a book. I thought this was an interesting question. And I thought if I could find a book that answered it, then I would just put it away and move on to another idea. I had this idea that I was going to write a book about the history, the American involvement in the First World War. That's kind of where my focus had been for a long time. And I had put a proposal together for publishers already with that subject in mind. But I just started, pulling at the thread, whatever books were available, some of the York Kelly book, the Frank Fain book, Naked Warriors. I, read through those. And I came away from them, with more questions than answers. I started to, think, and I started to talk. I took a trip pretty early on in the search. I was on a work trip down at Fort Pierce, and they were the archivist there, Ruth McSween, was kind enough to let me into the archives. And I was going through some World War II papers, and I came across a RAND study, the RAND organization, their semi-private think tank. I came across what seemed to me probably the first academic study on the SEAL teams, and the question that the author wrote was, how did the Navy create this unit? How did the Navy? It was written, during Vietnam, and it asked a very similar question to the one that had kind of been bouncing around my head for a few years. How did the Navy, create a unit to do these sorts of things that the Army should have created a unit to do a long time ago. The Marines should have created a unit to do this as well, but neither one had, or at least neither one had been successful enough to kind of keep the larger service off of their back, so they could become this kind of go anywhere, capture, kill commando force. And I thought when I found that, article, it kind of brought, at least it didn't answer many questions, but at least brought the question together for me. So that's where I started. And then there's just a 10-year process of, pulling the thread.
Yeah. And how do you even organize that much information, right? Like, how do you figure out, did you kind of read through everything and you came up with a structure to start? Did you even say, hey, I want to start, because the first chapter opens up with this story about the Marine raiders in World War II, the Macon Atoll, and kind of this, semi not all that successful raid and what happens there. So, you know what I mean? Like, how do you figure out, okay, that's the story I want to start with?
Well, I started to build a timeline pretty early on. That's kind of how I research and write to this day. I kind of work big to small. I initially built a probably 80 or so page timeline of major events in the history of not just the SEAL teams, but in special operations history. And I started to see, these little kind of inflection points in that timeline. This seemed, the Marine Corps Raider chapter is important because, the book isn't a history of the SEAL teams. People have said that it's a comprehensive history of the SEAL teams. It's not. It's a history, that asks a very specific question. How did the Navy, this larger institution, come to this realization that it needed an organization like this, or a sub-organization? And in order to answer that question about the Navy, you have to think about, well, what's the first organization that the Navy creates to do that sort of SEAL mission? and it was the Marine Corps Raiders. So it was just a steady sort of deliberate process of just putting things in order. Not really thinking about why any of this happened yet, but just think put it in order, and then once you start to see that order take shape, then those answers to the why questions, they start to kind of rise to the surface.
Yeah. Can we just frame up, just for people that might not even be that familiar, where does the military draw the line between conventional forces and special operations, right? Like, what distinguishes something as a special operations unit?
Well, that's a great question, and I don't think it's a question that we've ever really answered, even when we created SOCOM. So when you think about special operations, it's what are you talking about? Are you talking about elite units?
Yeah.
Or are you talking about units that do a specific kind of behind the lines mission? And it's a question that we still kind of grapple with today. If it's just elite units, Napoleon had elite units, but completely conventionally. Are we talking about just sort of behind the lines type operations? Because we've had behind the lines type organizations in every military in history. Cavalry, before we institutionalized what special operations were, cavalry performed the main missions of the special operations performed today. Those three, I call them the 3 R's of special operations: recon, wrecking, and raiding. Wrecking being sabotage and things like that. So those are traditionally the 3 missions that special operations do, and all of those missions are typically done behind enemy lines. But really, when you think about it, those missions promise to do something else, and they promise to achieve something more with less. You're promising to policymakers, to military planners, that you can do more with your small force, with your small dollar footprint, than this larger unit can at a much higher price, with significantly fewer risks to everybody. And if you cease to be able to do that, because we created this, we institutionalized what special operations were, in 1989 with the creation of SOCOM, 1989, 1990. My dates are, not great. But we said, to policymakers, we're going to create this apparatus that will guarantee, more with less.
Yeah.
And now we're in a situation, though, and this is a very American thing to do, where we've made a corporate structure, and now we're not just promising more with less, we're promising more with more. We have a 5th branch of service, essentially, that we're not exactly providing the thing that we originally said we would.
Right. Yeah.
So that's the challenge. What do special operations do? What can we? What are the promises that we can make, and what can we achieve?
Well, and so kind of to that point, prior to World War II, were there things that were considered special operations units? American, anyway, special operations. And when did we first use that term, special operations?
It's not until special operations forces. Well, we have special operations groups as far back as Korea. So it's probably the first instance where we start to use that special forces as a institution, as the institution we know today as the Green Berets. That's created in 1954. So that's when we really start to use the word special and combine with either operations or forces. But before that, you have all these sort of ad hoc units that the military has created. But the military's had raiding units, as far back as Americans have existed, as far back as, King Philip's War in New England. But, raiders, didn't always function as raiders. Raider units would often, perform their raid, and then they would fold back into the regular order of battle and march in line with the rest of the troops in any conventional attack.
Yep.
So it's not really until World War II that we start to segregate these units as special operations forces, lowercase letters, and not until Korea where we start to use the word special to really segregate them from the rest of the military.
Yeah. So can you give just kind of a broad brush of what these units looked like in World War II specifically? Because this is kind of, this is where the book starts. It's the first 3 chapters. And you specifically, again, you talk about the Marine Raiders. And I'll be honest, man, like throughout this book, there's so many units and names and designations and everything, and people too, where it's hard to kind of keep track of it sometimes, at least for me reading it, not being a student, as in depth on this as you are. But
No,
so you get kind of this Marine. Yeah. Well, but you spent, you've got 7 years of this or more at this point, far more under your belt of this, right? But so you've got kind of this Marine Raider unit, which I said has this op in the Macon Atoll where they're launched out of submarines in what amounts to Zodiacs. You've got the chapter 3 about the kind of initial Army Rangers there, the Darby guys, and then the middle portion there, which is what carries on, which is kind of the through line into the rest of it, is the Scouts and Raiders, which then kind of evolves, and you got the NCDUs and whatnot. So can you just kind of frame up, because it seems to me what's interesting about all that is how, like, it was very much sort of, hey, we need this capability real quick. Can we get some guys to do this kind of thing? We put it together, and then once it's done, we're going to throw it away. Right?
Yeah.
We're not going to, and this is kind of the classic downfall that in many ways leads to what happens here is these branches of the military, they're just kind of like, okay, well, that worked or it didn't work, and we're just going to trash it afterwards. So kind of just broad brush on that. World War II begins, and planners start to think, in two ways. They start to think about, potential opportunities that a specially trained force might provide, strategic effects on the battlefield, and they also start to think about specific problems that they need to solve. So I kind of categorize them, and I never really do this in the book, but in my head, I've always kind of considered the Army and the Marine Corps units in World War II to have been sort of entrepreneurial type units. Entrepreneurial in the sense that the creators of these units sort of saw an opportunity, something that they could do for conventional forces that the conventional forces couldn't do on their own. Guys like Evans Carlson, who saw the potential of a small force to provide or to achieve those strategic effects on the battlefield with limited cost. He thought, maybe I can use this unit to go behind the lines to create havoc while the conventional forces, fixing them in place or moving on them. Sort of the similar idea with the Rangers. The Rangers were created, were directly in the mold of the British commandos to raid coastlines. And then once the rest of the military is ashore, to hit strategic points, almost to act as like a harpoon, as the spear of the harpoon for the rest of the conventional forces to sort of pull up to them. So they're not created, the Marines and the Army Special Operations units, they're not really created with a clear problem to solve, but they're sort of created with an opportunity that they could possibly provide. The Navy units are completely different in the sense that each one of these units is created for a specific problem. The Scouts and Raiders are created because we have to mark beaches, we have to find beaches that you can actually get off of, and then you have to be able to signal the location of those beaches to the fleet. Very complicated, steps that you have to accomplish before you can bring an invading army ashore. Same thing with the NCDUs and the UDTs. NCDUs are created to destroy these obstacles below the high water mark ahead of the D-Day invasion forces. The UDTs are initially created as a underwater reconnaissance unit to find coral and then destroy that coral ahead of the invasion fleets. And once those effects are achieved, no one has any sort of expectation of what these Navy units could ultimately be. Nobody has like a runway for them, which is weird because the units that were created with this sort of imaginary opportunity type mentality are the ones that get disbanded at the end of World War II. The ones that could ultimately provide these huge strategic impacts, they're disbanded. There's no need for them after the war. And the units that were originally created to solve these very, very specific problems that probably won't exist after World War II, they're kept around, the UDT, which is odd. It's one of those odd sort of twists. And is that personality driven at the top? Is it
Well, it's
money?
weird.
Is it like, what is it
I
exactly
never,
that made
I
that
never
happen?
found the smoking gun on that. I never quite understood why the UDTs were kept around and the Rangers weren't. Um, Rangers, I attribute the Rangers disbandment in 1945, actually in January 1946. They're disbanded because typical Army downsizing after the war. That's
Okay.
that happens.
Yep.
But the UDT should have gone too, but they don't. And I think part of the reason that the UDT are not disbanded is because they have become so indispensable to amphibious operations at that point. Planners can't conceive of doing an amphibious operation without the UDT. And I know that they've become indispensable because planners won't even consider doing operations without them, and because they go from two 50-man teams in 1943 all the way to 40 100-man teams by the end of 1945. You have 4,000 underwater demolition team swimmers by the end, completely dwarfing, the size of the Rangers and the Raiders and everything else. The VAC Recon Company, which was the sort of ancestor of the Marine Corps Raiders, I don't think they ever got above 250 guys.
Yeah.
So,
how did guys find out about this stuff back then? Like how to sign up basically, because nowadays it's really, there's so much media out there. Everybody knows about all these organizations, and you can read endless amounts of information online about it and how to get there and how to screen and how to train and all of these things.
It was all by accident. It seems to be. The UDT is funny because the UDT is looking for guys that can swim. Mm-hmm. So they're I don't know exactly how the advertisements were going out through the fleet, but initially they're posting these things in passageways on ships or on duty stations and things like that. And anybody who can swim is not everyone that can swim, but a lot of people that can are volunteering for it. Rangers, a lot of these guys are trying to get out of bad units. They're not happy with where they are. They're either driving a truck for somebody behind the lines, or they're a clerk someplace else. They're actively trying to get their way to the battlefield, and they just for whatever reason can't. We've all been in the military, and we kind of know what the military bureaucracy is like. And, some guys who want to get there just simply can't. They get stopped. Yeah. So this provided a big opportunity for a lot of folks. But what is interesting is, in World War II, not one person that I came across that served in any one of these units got the war that they expected. They all, very, very few guys signed up, for the Army expecting that they were going to be a Ranger. It was something that, they saw, they volunteered for it, and before they knew it, they were, going off to do Ranger things, and the same thing for UDTs and Marines and things like that.
So that's interesting. Were you actually able to talk to guys that served in these units that are still around?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Oh, wow. How many of those guys were you able to talk to?
Not as many of the World War II guys. So, it became more and more as, as my research took me further and further forward. But even so, a lot of the guys that I talked to from the Korean War era and the Vietnam era, they had known guys that were in the World War II era.
On the X is proudly presented by Mechanics Wear. Known for their durability and comfort, Mechanics Wear gloves are made from top quality materials, offering protection against impacts, cuts, and abrasions. They feature advanced breathability and moisture wicking technology to keep hands cool and dry during any task. Designed with precision, these gloves provide a secure grip and flexibility, helping users work more efficiently and safely. They've certainly been my personal go-to glove for decades. Mechanics Wear gloves are available at most retailers, on mechanicswear.com, and on GSA Advantage. So speaking of personalities, a lot of this book too it's personality driven, where there's kind of key characters that meander through the whole thing. And it was actually shocking to me how the staying power of some of these guys from World War II all the way through Vietnam. Yeah. And the three certainly in NSW that jump out are Draper Kaufman, Phil Bucklew, and Buck Halperin. Can you talk a little bit about those guys? Because again, this is a thing where I knew those names. Certainly, you go to the Naval Center, and it's Phil Bucklew's center, and Draper. Everybody knows that name, but I didn't know much about them. And there's a couple things that jump out. I mean, Draper Kaufman is amazing because he can't even get in the Navy because his eyesight's so bad, and then he goes over and serves with the French, and then with the Brits, and it seems to me. Tell me if I'm off.
Don't forget, he's a POW too.
Oh, and he's a POW for 2 months, right? Yeah, right. So he's like in a prisoner of war camp. But tell me if I'm wrong in this, but the read I got out of that, because he then comes back and he starts the NCDUs and he starts Hell Week, like he's the initiator of Hell Week. It seems like so much of that was just he was like somebody who like didn't even need sleep. Like he was just such a hard guy, because he's this thing, right, where he's driving people back and forth off the front line in an ambulance for like 2 weeks and essentially doesn't sleep. He's just like sleeping upright in his Jeep, and then he goes and he's being an EOD guy basically in Hawaii, and it just seemed like he was cut from a cloth that made him so suited to start this training.
He had one of those early encounters with failure that I think helped define him. That moment where he's ready to graduate from the Naval Academy, he's getting ready to, follow in his father's footsteps, and assume the
who was a vice admiral. His dad was a vice admiral.
And not at the time.
Not at the time, but eventually.
Captain, but yes, eventually he becomes a vice admiral, one of the most important commanders in the Pacific Theater. Yes, but even at the time, he's a Navy Cross winner from the First World War. He's a name in the Navy, and he is. All young Draper wants to do is follow in his dad's footsteps and be a destroyer skipper, and he gets the rug pulled out from under him. And and it's for something that he has no control over. His eyesight is terrible. The depression is on. They don't have a ton of money to field or to field the fleet that they want to. So they're going through the ranks looking for anybody they can get rid of, and they unfortunately get rid of Draper. But maybe fortunate for the rest of us, because that failure becomes sort of the engine of his desperation to prove himself. To kind of not just find a place for himself, but find his way kind of back to his own family. I mean, his family is Navy royalty, and so he has this idea of what he wants to be. He wants to be his father. He wants to be that destroyer skipper. And at every point in all of his adventures, he gets stopped from doing that. So he joins the French army as an ambulance driver and becomes he's captured by the Germans, put in a POW camp. Then when he gets released, he goes and he joins the British Navy with the hope that he can get onto a ship and be that destroyer sailor like his old man. And again, they say you're not going to go on a ship. You're going to have to do something else. So he finds bomb disposal, but he's constantly trying to find his way, into that sort of similar situation as his dad, kind of measure up to his old man. And he just can't do it. Not until after the war that he's able to do that. And you can sense it in his letters. I never, printed up a whole letter or anything like that. But, in the correspondences that he had with his family, there is this, even though you don't even sense the pressure from the family, for him to measure up, he has that pressure on himself. And ultimately he does become that thing. He becomes that destroyer skipper. He doesn't command a destroyer, but he becomes a surface warfare officer, and he completely turns his back on the SEAL teams. Unlike, Phil Bucklew, and I'm sorry, not the SEAL teams, but he turns his back on the UDTs. It's not until 10 years after, Draper, leaves the UDTs, that he really starts to kind of look back over his shoulder and think about those experiences and how special they were. But Phil Bucklew, same thing. Phil Bucklew is, he's stopped initially from joining the branch of service that he wants to join. So he's
and these guys, just to interrupt there, these guys are football players, which I didn't know either. Phil Bucklew and Buck Halperin were like NFL players basically.
They were NFL players. Bucklew, at the beginning of the war, he's trying to start his own football team as the owner, coach, and player. the Columbus Bullies is what they were going to call it. Yeah. But yeah, kind of unlike Draper, he's Bucklew is just he's the indispensable man of naval special warfare. He's kind of always there. He's there on the fringes of the Omaha beach landings. I mean, he's scouting ahead of the troops, and from there he's going to Korea. He's detailed to the CIA. He's kind of working with the beach jumpers, and also helping to organize the UDT's participation in these CIA partisan raids. And then from there, he's the guy that ultimately saves the SEAL teams. He gives the SEAL teams a job in Vietnam by going to Vietnam and actually finding pushing the Navy into that conflict by writing what we now know as the Bucklew Report, and then being in that critical spot at that critical moment when they're ready to kick the SEALs out of Vietnam because they suck. And he puts the brakes on and convinces the guys over there to keep the SEALs and give them another chance.
Yeah.
So yeah, he is that indispensable guy. Buck Halperin, though, I mean, he was a person who's completely lost to NSW history. He's one of my favorite characters in the whole story just because of that. He's this completely unlikely character. He's too old. He's 34 when he enlists as a seaman. His talents, though, are quickly realized. He's kind of the odd man out, though, even with his football friends, because he's Jewish, but he's kind of unstoppable. And every success that Halperin has is just one more unexpected thing. He has no vision about what he's going to be, or he's just kind of grateful for every opportunity, and he just never stops volunteering. And those steps of volunteering take him from a humble skipper of a landing craft all the way to commanding a 2,000 man guerrilla army in China. I mean, it's remarkable.
It is. And so that's kind of the question is the success here in the staying power, right, of the, hey, not disbandment and at least evolving things, whether, it's not the NCDUs don't continue on, but it evolves and the UDTs grow out and all that. Is a lot of that attributed to the personalities there, like those guys and other folks that are in the high end of these things?
Yeah, absolutely. We wouldn't. There are a few, I call them oracles of NSW history, that really despise the attention that guys like Draper Kaufman have gotten in the history of the NSW and the UDT, but it's totally warranted.
Why do they despise it?
Well, his Draper Kaufman's sister wrote a book calling him America's first frogman.
Okay.
And from that, a number of other folks have conflated that to, say that Draper was America's first Navy SEAL. He wasn't. He wasn't even America's first frogman. But that doesn't mean that he wasn't consequential to our history. I mean, the reason that he's consequential is because he creates Hell Week. He gets this assignment in, it's middle of 1943, somewhere in 1943, when he learns that there's going to be an invasion of mainland Europe. They know that these obstacles exist on the beaches in Normandy, and they give him this kind of impossible assignment to create a unit that can, go ahead of the troops and blow these obstacles up so the troops don't get killed by them, or the landing crafts don't get tipped, and all the rest. He knows that he doesn't have a ton of time, but he also knows that he has to, kind of create a unit for an impossible mission. And so when he goes to Fort Pierce and he encounters the Scouts and Raiders, those NFL guys, Bucklew and Halprin, who are training, Army scouts to go ahead of the invading fleet and, mark beaches. They created this sort of 8-week long curriculum, much of which is based on, sort of NFL type, team building exercise,
yeah.
telephone poles and all the rest. Draper sees this 8-week long curriculum and he's like, well, I need to create teams that are really good at solving problems, that are really tight with one another, but I don't have a ton of time. So he sees, kind of a multi-phase opportunity in taking their curriculum and compressing it. So that's what he does. He takes their 8-week long curriculum and he compresses it to 5.5 days, and that's how we got Hell Week.
Yeah. And he puts himself through it at some point too, right?
Yeah, and that's an important point, I think, even for this, today, because we've had, I was quoted in the New York Times not too long ago as, somebody who has questions about Hell Week, as, and which I was not misquoted. I think they took my quotes completely out of context, though. I'm one of probably the greatest advocates of it. I think it's, one of those accidental courses that we have created that is, it is, it's probably the best thing that we have ever come up with not only finding guys that can accomplish this stuff, but making better guys, making guys who are able to see something that seems impossible, but also to come up with different pathways in their head to get through it.
Yep.
So, but even, when he created this thing, there were people who thought that this was absurd. There's no way you can have this, a course with this high of an attrition rate. So in order to defend his own program, this guy who had already survived, the Blitzkrieg on the Western Front, the POW camp, the Blitz, he puts himself through the course just to prove it can be done. And he does it. And that gives the course kind of a state of execution. At least planners don't get rid of it right away. But when D-Day happens, and when they see that this unit that Draper has created, not only accomplished their mission, but accomplished their mission with some of the highest casualties of the entire D-Day landing, they realized that this course actually did work. And so planners decide that, well, there's probably something to this. So they not only keep it, but they franchise it to the Pacific for the UDTs.
Yeah. And I heard you talking, I don't think it's in the book, but about something where, I don't know if it was that, I think it was someone saying like, how much harder than combat or whatever should this be? And there was, maybe this is urban legend, but someone was like, they were like, what should it be? Just as hard, twice as hard or whatever. And someone's like, needs to be 10 times as hard.
Yeah. That story's from Rick Woolard. Rick Woolard had, I'm sure you know Rick, but Rick is former commander of SEAL Team 6. When he was a young frogman, he had an opportunity to actually have dinner with Draper, had him over to his house. And they had, I think Draper, it was ahead of one of the SEAL reunions on the East Coast. This was right before Draper passes away. But he's, kind of coming around, back to his, realizing how important, not only his role in the SEAL teams was, but also how important the SEAL teams and NSW was to him. So he's kind of, coming to these reunions and things like that, and he's feeling a little bit nostalgic, but he's not a huge fan of all the attention that he's getting. So Rick had invited him over at his house just for dinner, and he went over to Rick's house, and they had a long evening together. And he told this story about, when they got that assignment there at Fort Pierce, he was just sort of sitting around the table, with this other group of kind of combat tested chief petty officers, and he starts to he's going around the table, asking that question, how hard should this course be? I mean, they all know what the mission is. Should it be twice as hard, 3 times as hard? And then one of the chiefs finally puts his hand on the table and says it should be 10 times as hard. Yeah, this is a mission that we can't really understand it today. It's the bombers weren't accurate enough to destroy the bombs on the beaches, and even if they had been able to destroy the obstacles on the beaches, the splash of the explosions would probably just have scattered all of the mines everywhere. So you can't do that. Naval gunfire also probably not accurate enough, and so there's only one way to do this. It's by hand. You have to send guys in. They have to, destroy these obstacles one at a time. It's an impossible mission.
Yeah. Yeah. Are you as blown away as I am by, like, when you read their citations, their medal citations, of just how gutsy these guys were? Because, like, look, you and I have served in the modern day teams, and certainly have been around heroic people, heroic actions, all of that. But I still just I am in awe sometimes when I read about the actions of these guys in the circumstances they were in, with this just like basically no technology whatsoever. It just amazes me sometimes.
Yeah, it does. And it's amazing. You read the citation, and I'm amazed by how understated they are.
Yeah, I agree. Yep.
And when you, particularly the, Normandy, reports, when you're looking at, which of the NCDUs was awarded a Navy Cross and who was awarded Silver Stars. I mean, you take Bill Freeman or something like that. I mean, his Navy Cross should have been a Medal of Honor. Most of the Silver Stars that were awarded on that day should have been Navy Crosses, if not also Medal of Honor. They are impossible circumstances. And you're right. I mean, I would say there were two advantages that I had in writing this book over other SEALs. Well, one, I was a SEAL. I knew the culture. I knew the institution of the SEAL teams. I knew its biases and things like that. So if somebody else had come along and wanted to ask the same question, I had a leg up on them in that sense. Gosh, I don't remember where I was going with it. Maybe edit that section out.
Yeah, no problem. No problem.
Long day.
It's interesting when you talk about this, and with the inception of Hell Week. I think I'd always considered that to be obviously unique and special, but I don't know that I'd ever really thought about how much of a secret sauce it may be, and how much impact that may have had, the formation of that specific part of training, in the trajectory of everything that happened after that in terms of the team's success.
It's remarkable. It's remarkable for a couple of reasons. One, it's completely unlike anything else that exists in special operations. When you compare that to the crucibles of the other branches of service, all of those crucibles were based off of other crucibles. Whether it's Ranger training was in large part based off of the British Commando experience. Excuse me, the Delta Forces selection. It's almost completely based off of the SAS selection model. The NSWs is completely American. Mm-hmm. It was created organically, and not only that, but it's the oldest crucible that we have in the entire inventory. And so when you consider the folks that are around today, saying that this training should be changed, or this training is too severe, things like that, it's the most time-tested crucible that we have in the entire inventory of special operations. This is it. It was started in 1943, and it's gone, except for a couple of interruptions after World War II, and then again in the 50s. It's gone without interruption all the way to present day. It's the longest thing that we have. We're going to hit 100 years in 19 years.
Yeah, wow.
That's remarkable.
Wow. When did it's not in the book, but when did it become BUDS? At what point?
When did we change it from UDTR to BUDS? Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I was thinking about that question the other day. That's a question for Rick. It's right after. I'm betting 76, 77.
Okay. Wow, that late.
Yeah.
That late. Wow, I wouldn't have thought that. Okay. But did the class numbers go all the way back though? Like, or did that start? You know what I mean? Like. Yeah,
those started in 1962.
Okay. Yeah. That's when the actual, okay. But at the time it wasn't called BUDS.
wasn't called Buds. It was called UDTR.
Got it. Okay. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the classes are those are still sequential. So class UDTR class 1, it would be Buds class 1.
Got it. Got it. Okay.
But
okay.
there is, I think it goes all the way up to 36, 37 before we have consolidated classes, because there's still an East Coast class and a West Coast class up until that point.
Yep. Okay. And were they the same number, the East and West Coast classes? Okay.
Yeah, it would just be it would be UDTR 13 East, UDTR 13 West.
Okay.
So
got it. So the last piece of the World War II component of this, which I didn't know really anything about, is this stuff in China, which I think if you ask most people, hey, what was the Navy doing in China in World War II? They'd be like, what are you talking about? Yeah. And that's probably what I would have said before reading this.
It's what I said. I started to think about the China chapter. I knew that this China piece had existed. I knew that Naval Special Warfare had participated in a guerrilla war in China. I didn't know how important it was or anything like that, and I didn't really know the details of it. When I had built that initial timeline, I hadn't put anything in there about this experience in China. I'd heard the phrase amphibious Roger. I'd heard the phrase or the name Sako. I called it Seiko at the time.
So yeah.
But I didn't know what it was. All I knew when I finished my 5th chapter, which was my chapter on the UDT, I had 18 months until my book was due with the publisher. And I knew that I didn't have time to take on a completely new topic that I didn't know anything about, that very little had been written about by anybody else. So I thought, well, I'll deal with the China stuff by mentioning it in an introductory paragraph to my UDT chapter on the Korean War, because I knew that the UDT were going to get into sort of guerrilla operations, leading guerrillas. So I thought, well, I'll talk about this China piece very briefly. So I committed to doing about a week's worth of research to have for that introductory paragraph. And 1 week turned into 2 weeks, 2 weeks turned into 3. One paragraph quickly turned into 2 pages. 2 pages quickly turned into 4. Before I knew it, I knew what I had, but I didn't know what to do with it. I was like, this could be a book. Nobody's ever heard of this. I mean, if I knew that if I hadn't heard about it, then nobody had heard about it.
Yeah.
So I had to take a long kind of break. Not like I took a long, I took a couple of days to think about what I was going to do, because I knew that if I committed to doing this chapter and doing it right, it was going to completely derail me from my timeline with the publisher. I didn't know what would happen at that point. It's my first book and everything like that. So I had, it was a big moment. I ended up shutting myself into I was writing at the time in a walk-in closet at a little house that we had moved into. And I just sat there for a while. I just stared at the computer, and before I knew it, I was just like, okay, I know what I need to do. And I sat down and I started to work on it. And it didn't just derail me by a couple of months. It derailed me for an entire year. It took a whole year to research and write that chapter. But it was completely worth it. When I went to the archives, I found boxes of material that people hadn't looked at since they'd been put there. And discovered these stories, and it's probably my most satisfying chapter because of that.
And what's the significance of that piece of the story of the UDT in China?
Without that experience, I don't think planners would have quite realized that they could. I don't think Navy planners would have quite realized how far afield they could push the Navy from their traditional routes, from the water. It was a 100% Navy operation with a handful of Marines to kind of help the Navy guys train the guerrillas and then lead them. But it was run like a naval organization. It was run as if Mary Miles, who was the the commander of the whole thing. He treated, this whole fleet like it was a fleet, like these miniature camps, around China were just, he would send mission type orders, decentralized command. It's perfect application. And he would just expect results. And these, individual camps, they had to just make stuff happen. Not much different than if they had been a submarine out in the middle of the Atlantic or the Pacific. So it was an eye-opening moment, and it was eye-opening because guys like Arleigh Burke, saw this, going on, and they, had experiences with Mary Miles, and they heard his stories. And ultimately, when it came time for the Navy to start thinking about guerrilla warfare, this was in the back of their head when they were doing this, because they didn't have an experience like this in World War II. It wasn't like there'd been a Navy Rangers or anything like that. It was the closest thing that the Navy had to it was this China experience.
Yeah. So a couple things out of that. Do you think, I was trying to think of this too, if there's a personality component to this as well, which may be fostered in scenarios like this, which is, the ability to just sort of figure it out on your own, right? And situations like that where you're just kind of cut off and you just have to sort it out on your own is a lot of where the success lies. Like that carries over to Vietnam, certainly, where it's like, we're just going to make shit happen, basically. And I wonder if that is something that is, again, sort of fomented out of the experience that had gone on, or even, I even wonder about the Navy itself, because like just even big Navy, like people that are attracted to the Navy, you're sort of you're on an island, right? You're on a boat or ship all by yourself out there. And that sort of breeds a little bit of a different culture where you're not on land and surrounded by, endless amounts of people and buildings and all of that.
Yeah.
Do you
100%.
think that's a piece of it?
Oh, absolutely. I talk, when we want to talk about, what distinguishes the SEAL teams from, the rest of the components of within SOCOM, I think the two main things are, one, the training. SEAL training is, completely different than the rest of the training that everybody else gets. It's, wider in scope. It's more difficult. It's 10 times longer than anybody else's, selection course. But it's, there's also this Navy DNA. And I don't think that we've ever really, when I was a young, frogman, I always, I never really understood why we were in the Navy. I was kind of looked down on the fleet. But I think one of the things that gives the SEAL teams its strength is exactly that association with the Navy. Yeah. All of that, all of those procedures, all of the those little structural components of accountability, and the expectation that you are going to be. It's not going to be a mistake that you're going to be removed from the chain of command. You are going to be out on your own. You're going to have to adapt. All of those expectations are there, and they're expectations that we have for just regular shipborne sailors.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think the SEALs are special, precisely because of that connection to the fleet.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so too. I think there's something to that.
And I think we can still learn a lot. I think one of the interesting things about, Vietnam is, the first commander of the SEALs in Vietnam was not a SEAL himself. He was a submariner. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, the Norvell Ward, who was the first commander of the SEALs in Vietnam, he was a kind of legendary World War II era submarine skipper. He's and I write in the book that he was known, for he was awarded a Navy Cross for destroying 5 ships with 4 torpedoes, and also for bottoming out a submarine at one point to perform an emergency appendectomy of one of his sailors with a couple of bent spoons. His grandson is now one of the senior commanders in the SEAL teams.
Oh, wow. Cool.
Yeah, that's pretty neat.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
You mentioned Arleigh Burke there. And again, these are it's funny, some of the names in this whole arc of a story, these sort of big Navy CNO character guys, him, Admiral King,
Yeah.
Elmo Zumwalt, right? These are they're they're all buildings, and for me coming from the Naval Academy, it's like they're names of buildings and fields and stuff like that. And I think, look, I'm sure I was in classes where I learned something about these guys, but I didn't remember much about them.
Yeah.
But what was interesting to me is how big of a part they played too. Like Arleigh Burke played a big part in this, and I loved that guy after reading about him in your book. Like, what a badass, and whatever it was, like 2 years longer as CNO than any other person in history.
Yeah,
and
he has the record.
Yeah, I mean, it was just it was so cool to learn about those. I mean, again, was that something that was surprising to you? Like the amount of impact that that level those guys had. I specifically think of him in that scenario, kind of coming out of Korea into the early part of Vietnam, and then Elmo Zumwalt too, kind of later in Vietnam.
Oh yeah, to complete surprise for me. Never expected that this book would end up being a love letter to the U.S. Navy, but it ended up being that. And you know, I often get asked, you know, who was the consequential person, the indispensable guy in the creation of the SEAL teams. It wasn't Draper Kaufman. He was, you know, one, he wasn't the creator of the SEAL team. He wasn't America's first frogman. He's important, but he's not the indispensable guy. The indispensable guy is Arleigh Burke. And part of that is because of this this mixture in him of expectations unlike anybody else that I've ever come across, but also expectations that he was for people to be creative. He wasn't always going to be the guy that came up with ideas, but by God, he demanded that you start coming up with ideas and think about what this institution is going to be. And not only think about what this institution is going to be and how it's going to be of service to the rest of the U.S. military, but also to the country in general. But think specifically about how this institution is going to close with the enemy. He did not want the Navy to decline into a sort of merchant marine, you know, a tougher merchant marine, you know, that was just responsible for transporting troops from one battlefield to another. He wanted the Navy to be as close to the enemy as the Army was, as consequential as the U.S. Air Force. And so he pushed that responsibility down to his guys. They came up with these ideas. And once he saw these ideas and that, you know, connected to the experiences that he knew about in China, they're the
Yeah. What I love about him too is it's like his Naval Academy career. It's kind of like, like he's nothing special at the Naval Academy. It's nothing. Like whatever. And that is such I've seen that play out numerous times with people kind of my age group too. It's like having great grades and being a varsity athlete and any of that, like that's all well and good, but it doesn't mean anything in terms of how good of a leader you're going to be and how successful you're going to be in the military, you know, and consequential too. You know,
well, I can't remember his name, but the speaker at my bud's graduation, he gave a talk about, you know, how incredible it was that we had graduated this training, but also reminded us that it was just training.
Yeah.
And it didn't matter. And he said, you know, the most remarkable person in his class when he had gone through BUDS was the least remarkable person. Yeah. Almost failed, you know, a number of things, and ultimately went to Vietnam, you know, kind of as a strap hanger. But once he got to Vietnam, he became Tommy Chris. That was Tommy. Right. Yeah. He just, you know, he graduates BUDS as a nothing, you know, no account, you know, SEAL. And when he gets there, he becomes this, you know, becomes what he became.
Or Bob Gallagher, right? The Eagle there, same thing, where it's like, you know, they're just sort of, you look at him and you don't think anything, he's impressive at all. But,
you look at him, he's a dock worker. He doesn't look like anything. He's fat. He's not in shape. Like, he's just like, who is this guy? Yeah. He's perfectly built for war.
Hey everybody, Chris Irwin here, Communications Director for the Navy SEAL Foundation and the On the X podcast host. So Ironclad is our video production company. They are our podcast production company, and they've been with us since before I was even at the foundation, so more than 6 years. They're pretty much in some way plugged in with just about everything we do at the foundation, certainly on the communications side of things, and I honestly don't know what I would do without them. So they are absolutely top shelf in every regard in what they do. They're able to capture things that really look authentic, especially when it comes to some of the operator footage that can be challenging to do. And everything else is just done at such a high level that I don't really have to think about it or worry about it. If you or your organization or your company are looking for video production, if you're looking for post-production, podcast hosting, these guys can do it all. Check them out, ironcladagency.com. Highly recommended. By the way, I love these characters. I was reflecting on the fact that I have never met anybody named Draper in my life, or Harley, or Elmo. Like, all these guys have names of people. Like, I've never met anybody with these names, and it's just so great that they happen to have these names that make them so unique. So coming out of kind of World War II and into Korea, what's the evolution at that point that, again, sort of keeps things going? And are there other units that are kind of being stood up at this point too, that are sort of vying for this type of capability, this sort of guerrilla direct action type mission?
Not at that point. No, there's nothing. The closest thing that would have been the Marine Corps or Marine Recon was disbanded after World War II. They are stood back up. I can't remember what year. It's either 48 or 49. So they are starting to sort of creep into that sort of direct action, behind the lines, coastal raiding type mission. But in Korea, there's really nothing else. There's no Army Rangers or anything like that. And so when the Korean War starts, and naval planners start to think, how are we going to project naval power ashore? They start to think, well, we could start to send raiding parties ashore to destroy some of these trains. And the only unit that exists that could possibly do that are the UDTs. So very quickly, the UDT within the first couple of weeks of the war they're not scouting beaches or doing any of the things that they had done in World War II, but they are moving inland to start blowing up bridges. Now, that is not at all what the UDTs thought that they were going to be doing. After World War II, the UDT walked out of that war thinking most likely there's not going to be another large-scale amphibious invasion again. So they start to think, how are we going to maintain our relevance in the fleet? One planner in particular starts to think, that if we're going to maintain our relevance, if we're going to, we need to think, how are we going to destroy ships that are docked in an enemy port or something like that. So he pushes the UDT from the surface of the water under the water, starts practicing with scubas, experimenting with scubas, with underwater submersibles, submarine lockouts, all the rest. That's Frank Fain. He's the guy that wrote the book Naked Warriors, which is kind of the first attempt that anyone ever made to write the history of the UDT and the NCDUs in World War II. Interesting that he's the person who probably knows most about the history of this institution. And so, knowing that history, he should probably be the one best suited to kind of articulate what the Navy or the UDT's future should be. He's completely wrong. When you go to Korea, there's none of those opportunities that he had anticipated. There's no submarine lockout opportunities. There's no ports that you can, swim guys and submersibles in to destroy ships or anything like that. When he gets there, or when the UDTs get there, none of those opportunities exist. They have to completely adapt. What I think is interesting is that even though these UDTs haven't prepared for that war, because they've been preparing for something and they've been experimenting, and they've been experimenting for several years, they are very capable when they get there to quickly adapt to something else that they have no background in.
Yeah, right.
So they do.
Yep.
Which
and
is
again,
it's an interesting parallel today, because the SEAL teams are kind of in a crisis of, not conscience, but crisis of what the future is going to be. And everybody's anticipating that the next war is going to be, potentially in the Pacific, potentially against China, and so everybody's sort of pushing under the water. And the expectation, is that that's going to be the next war, maybe. but also maybe not. But what is the price of that innovation, even if that innovation goes in the wrong direction? I don't know that it's such a high price. But what I do think is, you would, the highest price would be, to completely just tread water, to not innovate at all. You have to, you have to think, you have to, even if you're going to be wrong, you have to adapt.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, I mean, I think that is one of the character traits that is so prevalent throughout the community. That's so important, right? It's sort of the key thing, just getting back to Hell Week a little bit, right, is I've always felt like the training itself, it doesn't like create SEALs in the sense that, yeah, you teach skills and all that, but it identifies them, right? It finds the guys that can do the job, that like possess the character that's required for it. And then it is the proactivity and the sort of adaptability and creativity that I think sets everything apart. That's the thing that makes the difference, right? It's again, you go throughout the whole thing, it's just make shit happen and figure it out, right? Like that's kind of the attitude that's so important.
How do you best create an organization that can do that?
Yep.
And not how do you create it, how do you support it? I think, about Vietnam and the experience that the SEALs had in Vietnam, and that, not one of the adaptations that the SEALs came up with in Vietnam was originated at the top and was pushed down. Not one of them did. All of those innovations came from the bottom. But what's important about that is that the organization was agile enough to see those innovations from the bottom and then support them at the top, create various training schools back, stateside, to franchise all of those successes, to have funding mechanisms to purchase, things like new boats, new guns, things that were, being effective, and quickly push that equipment back to the platoons in Vietnam.
Yeah.
So how do you do that?
Yeah.
Because right now we've got a very, very, like I talked about in the beginning, we got a very, big force, and and that when you have a force, you have to have bureaucracy, and that bureaucracy supports the force. But bureaucracies typically build walls; they don't build wheels. It's very difficult to reorient, a big institution.
Yeah.
So how do you? Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, talk a little bit about Vietnam, because that's your book kind of concludes with that.
Yeah.
The last, whatever it is, couple of chapters there, 3 or 4 chapters. But just the evolution coming out of Korea, the development of the naming of the SEAL teams themselves, which I think everybody sort of thinks John F. Kennedy created the Navy SEALs. Like there's that kind of lore out there a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
And I can't even remember the guy's name, but the name is like there's like a memo from somebody that's just like, hey, you know what? A good name for this would be this, right?
Bill Gentner. Yeah. I met his daughter at one of my first book signings. It was just random that she showed up there. It was really neat.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. But it's interesting because, that expectation was there from the beginning. When, if ever you feel self-conscious around a group of soldiers or rangers or Delta Force guys, about why you're in central Afghanistan or something like that, it's not your fault that that you're there. It's their fault. The reason, that there's an L in the acronym for SEAL is because, these other institutions had failed to be there before us. There was a gap in that order of battle. And those planners under, Arleigh Burke's staff, they were anticipating that this force, this unit, would be projected pretty far inland. And that's why they added that to the acronym, Sea, Air, and Land. They wanted to, push the Navy, inland. Yeah. And that's, but they don't, when they create, this idea, or when they write these, these initial ideas, they don't really know what that means. They know that this new unit should be able to, pull Navy, or should afford the Navy the ability to project force inland. But they don't know exactly how to do that. The Navy's not an army. The Navy's never, except for that, experience in China, the Navy's never fought a land battle. So how do you do this? And what's a unit like that supposed to do when it gets inland? And the SEALs themselves didn't know either. So when this unit is created, the SEALs are created. They're all pulled from the UDTs, and they initially think, well, we should be the coastal raiders of the U.S. military. So that's what they initially start to be. They train for that coastal raiding type job. But they also start, they're seeing what the Army Special Forces are doing. They're going to be those force multipliers. They're going to train indigenous forces and lead them. So there's kind of two wings of the SEALs that are developing. There's the coastal raider kind of crew, and then there's the special forces type guys. The unconventional warfare type guys. But it's not until they actually get into Vietnam that they start to. When the rubber meets the road, they don't really know what to do. They don't really know. We have this idea that the SEALs, when they first deploy, it's the men with green faces, and they start to, make a name for themselves as these masters of finding the enemy in the middle of the night and, taking them back and getting intelligence out of them. It's not what happens. When they get to Vietnam, they don't know what they're doing. They can't find the enemy. They're setting up these, ambushes all night long on, canals and trails and things like that. It's very unproductive, and it's very, dissatisfying. It takes a long time before they really figure out, how to do this, how to bootstrap intelligence, and not only just bootstrap intelligence, but use that intelligence to find somebody and then shake down that person for more information, so you can find 5 more people. It's the SEALs that create this, sort of capture kill intelligence cycle. So the self-perpetuating intelligence cycle that we know today.
Yeah. And you mentioned the Green Berets in there, and there's a whole chapter in here about them, and the fact they had been in place and around for longer, and had more guys and all of that. So why
didn't they?
Like why? What happened there, right? In terms of the.
Well, we talk about Kennedy as being the founder of the SEAL teams, or the founder of special forces, or special, of everybody. Kennedy's really important in that story, but not in the ways that we think. One, he's important because he really just puts the pedal to the metal on unconventional thinking, on unconventional forces. But he's really mostly interested in counterinsurgency. So before Kennedy comes into office, the Green Berets have been around for 6 years, 7 years, but they are mostly a kind of ranger force.
Mm-hmm.
Not exactly rangers, but not exactly not rangers either. They're sort of their expectation is that they're going to be kind of like the operational groups of the OSS in World War II. They're going to drop into a country, link up with a guerrilla force, and they're going to lead that guerrilla force on sort of ranger type missions, raids, the 3 R's, the recon, wrecking, and raiding. It's not until Kennedy comes into office that he sees this, the Green Berets, and he thinks these guys could be probably used not just to link up with a partner force, but this unit could probably be used to deny forces to the enemy. As long as you can drop these guys into the mountains in Vietnam and teach the Montagnards or whoever else how to defend themselves from communists, then at least you'll deny that that group to the enemy. And that's sort of what he does. So the Green Berets cease to be this commando force, this ranger force, and they become counterinsurgency specialists. They're digging ditches or digging wells, and providing medical assistance, and they are doing some military things, and they are really out there, and some of the lengths that these guys go to just to survive are incredible. but they don't operate in any sense that you and I would know as like commandos.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this huge gap, the military, command in Vietnam. They need a unit that can go out there and find these Viet Cong leaders and Viet Cong functionaries and everything else. And the Green Berets just aren't doing that in the beginning. Now the Green Berets do quickly realize that they have this own gap in their organization, and they create a number of organizations to fill that gap. But they have so many problems in their sort of structure. The SEALs are successful in Vietnam because these guys train together, they deploy together, they all stay in the same compound, and when they're done, they redeploy back to the United States together. The Green Berets and the rest of the U.S. Army, they are deploying like onesie twosies. A guy is, he's graduating from the Q course, he's getting sent to Vietnam, and he's linking up with a team that's been over there already. He doesn't know anybody. It's on the job training. He's there for a year, and then he comes back alone. And all of his experience is lost. There's no platoon turnover or anything like that.
That piece was really interesting. I had no idea about this, where it's basically, hey, we're going to turn this into a PCS.
Yeah, I know. And it's and I always, whenever I talk to any of these units, be careful, with these, seemingly innocuous little things, these little, administrative type changes that you make to the force.
Yeah.
You don't realize, how, massively impactful, a small thing like that, can have on the organization itself.
Yeah. I mean, I was just shaking my head reading that, like going, oh, of course. Yeah. Let's save some money and make these guys, this a PCS move. Right.
Yeah. It's tragic.
Yeah. For a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
Right. Like, not the least of which is like not paying the guys as much.
Right.
So I mean, the book kind of wraps up with the Mike Thornton and Tommy Norris story, and everybody certainly from our line of work knows that story. When you set out, did that feel like the right ending point from the beginning, or had you thought like, maybe I want to keep going with this, or?
Oh, no. I knew that I was going to stop in Vietnam, because I knew that I needed to get to the point. The question that I asked was, how did the Navy, come to create the country's first permanent land-focused capture-kill commando unit? I knew that the SEALs became that in Vietnam, so I knew I needed to get from World War II to Vietnam. I just didn't know how I was going to. And I didn't know which was the first platoon that sort of became that for the SEAL teams. And then, from that, the rest of the SEAL teams sort of adopt that model. So every chapter was, like, I didn't know where I was going. I mean, I knew that I needed to get from the Marine Corps Raiders, at Macon Island, all the way to the SEALs in Vietnam. But the path that I used to get there, I had no idea. Yeah. It was, your guess was as good as mine. But I also knew that, there were a lot of things that had already been covered that I didn't want to recover. And, the Mike Thornton and Tommy Norris story, it's been covered so many times. I was like, it's an important story, but it's an important story for, not for the story of the SEAL teams, not for, demonstrating how, the SEALs became the SEALs. It's interesting in different ways. But I did want to talk about it. So I thought it'd be interesting. Well, what if I talked about, their experience, receiving the medals, honor, and it ended up becoming like the perfect scene because, in a series of interviews that I did with Tommy, he's talking to me about, Mike sitting next to, Admiral Holloway, who's the, chief of naval operations, and, and he's confiding in Mike Thornton, an E5 second class petty officer, that he's thinking about getting rid of the SEAL teams. It's just this crazy moment that these guys have. Anyway, I thought it was a really fun way to end it.
Yeah. What was, over the course of all of this, what was the thing that surprised you the most about the story? or you weren't
About the
expecting?
story, oh gosh, I don't know. Everything was a surprise. All the characters were a surprise. There was nothing that I was surprised how hard it was going to be. I never, when I signed the contract for this, I signed the contract to write it in 2 years, um, and turn in a manuscript of 100,000 words. It ended up taking I'd already been working on it for a year and a half before I signed the contract for it, but it took 7 years from that moment to turn the manuscript in. And then it took another year, to, edit and, complete all the endnotes. And while I was, working on it, guys were still, contacting me and I was literally writing this book for 2 weeks until it printed.
Yeah. Sure.
The publisher, ultimately just told me, stop. You cannot make any more changes. You can't add anything else to it.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think the whole thing was just, I was just surprised how, in the aftermath of it, how special it's become to so many people.
Yeah.
That's totally unexpected.
Is it required reading at this point?
Yeah. So it's required reading, I believe, at DevGru for, I don't know exactly how the Warcom has made it required reading, but I believe it is required reading for anybody above chief. So
that's great.
And and the most surprising thing is that it's the commander of USASOC has, he has guys reading, the chapters on the Green Berets and the Rangers,
Yeah,
which is fantastic. I didn't think that any Marine or Army guy would read this thing because I just thought, I never attempted to say, never once did I even let this creep into my head that I was writing a book to say that the SEALs were better than another unit. I never wanted to say that. I always structured the question very specifically to say, how did the Navy come to create the first permanent, land-focused unit? Because they were the first to be that permanent unit. But it's been a surprise just to see how much value people have. I thought I was kind of hanging it out on a limb, writing a book about the SEAL teams that would go 10 chapters without first mentioning the SEAL teams.
Yeah, right. Yep.
And not only that, but, a book that was going to, bounce back and forth between Army units and Marine Corps units. I mean, so when they, when we're going back and forth with the publisher on what the title was, they were insisting, on, saying that this was an origin story of the SEAL teams, By Water Beneath the Walls, the untold origin story of the SEAL teams. And I was just dead set against it. I refused to call it that, and I ended up going through and listing all the documentaries and all the other books that have been written with that exact subtitle.
Yeah, well done.
By God, I will not let this book be called that. One, it didn't, it didn't address in any way, these other chapters, about the Army and the Marine Corps. That's why we ultimately, they finally broke and agreed to the rise of the SEAL, or the Navy SEALs. So
yeah,
it was surprising to me, and I hope it's surprising to the people that read the book, just how interconnected all of these units are, to each other, and how the SEALs wouldn't exist without the Marine Corps. The SEALs wouldn't be here without the Rangers. One of my favorite things, and when I talk about this, I try not to get emotional, but one of my favorite things about this whole story is how the SEALs, before Vietnam, had become the gosh, how do you say it? The most the most consolidated group of Ranger School graduates in the U.S. military were the SEALs,
right?
Which is remarkable. And if you don't think that the Rangers and the SEALs are connected, in some way, then, if that fact doesn't convince you enough, then, let me remind, the viewers that who the who the SEALs were on the way to come to the aid to when the Extortion 17 helicopter went down. They were on their way to not just come to the aid of Rangers, but they were on their way to come to the aid of Rangers who were named, their call sign was Team Darby, which I spend an entire chapter, describing in this book.
Yeah.
It's I don't know. I suppose that was, one of the more surprising things.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
What was probably the most surprising thing? I got to, I've told this story a couple of times, but there was a firefight that my team was involved in Iraq in 2007, and one of the SEALs that was on the mission, he was shot in the head, and we were kind of pinned down, and we were trying to get Kazovac to come down, and we couldn't. Birds wouldn't come down, so we were cut off and trapped, and our other SEAL unit was trying to make their way to our position. They couldn't get there, and so there was a Marine who was at a fob who just commandeered a couple of Humvees, and the road that was connecting our little village to the fob was notoriously known for IEDs and everything. So he took these two Humvees, with a couple of Marines in them, and he barreled up this road to come to our rescue. Put his Humvees in between our building and his 50 cows and the enemy, and allowed the helos to come down and evacuate the SEAL and save the SEAL and everything like that. It's an incredible story. But the best part about that story was, I don't know if you recall the manuscript that I read in the archives at the SEAL Museum. The author of that report was the father of the Marine who came to our rescue.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Yeah.
That's cool. That's cool. Last couple questions here real quick. This is a really broad question, so we'll try to keep it short. I know we're going to wrap it up, but you sort of mentioned like where we are right now with threats and things like that. What's of the kind of the lessons that came out of this that you see, how do you think we apply those to where we are now in terms of the evolution of the military, just in general?
Well, we're going to get it wrong.
Okay. Yeah.
And we know that because no one has ever gotten it right. But like I said before, that doesn't let you off the hook. You have to adapt, and you have to make judgment calls, and you have to invest in directions that may not be fruitful in the beginning, but the very fact that you're innovating is going to short circuit so many problems that you're going to come into even if you go in the wrong direction. So just the process of innovating, the process of training, it's going to show you those gaps that you have, those problems that you have as an organization. But forcing the organization to adapt to new threats is good for every organization. It prevents stagnation. But yeah, we're going to be wrong. We just have to, I suppose, not get so worried about the future of NSW, as opposed to just thinking we are going to be useful. The one lesson of this 80+ year history of this organization is that we have always found those gaps. Or this institution has always found gaps to kind of fill into and find relevance. So if you're worried about NSW having a seat at the table, I'm not worried about it. NSW will be perfectly fine. There's no better organization on the planet for adapting and finding work.
Yeah. Right.
But I don't know. I don't know their leadership lessons. One of the best things that I saw in finding all of these personalities was just how different they all were. There was no one leader
totally.
type. Anybody can lead. It's just and I don't know. There's trying to compare Bob Gallagher to Draper Kaufman. I mean, completely different personalities,
Yes.
something like that. I'm not sure that if they were sitting at the same table that they would have a lot to talk about.
Yeah. Yep.
But, you know, there's two guys that are just, you know, two of the most incredible leaders we've ever had. And that's a great lesson for us. I mean, you know, anybody can lead. So if you think that you don't have the right personality type, you know, for this business, well, you're wrong. Anybody, you're welcome. You're welcome in. So,
last question is just on the title. You tell the kind of the quick snippet there at the beginning of, is it Justinian? Is that the the name of the? Yeah.
Yeah.
What made you want to use that?
That's a good question.
That story, that saying, so to speak.
I had a hard time coming up with the title for this book. The working title of it when I got the contract was The Evolution. The Evolution, you know, I had this idea, you know, that there's that picture on the wall at McPee's of, you know, the UDT swimmer, you know, next to the Vietnam guy kind of crouched down, you know, next to the you know, the SEAL operator in Iraq or Afghanistan, you know, fully upright, you know, like the
yeah, I get what you're saying.
Yeah,
right.
you know,
evolution.
Yeah,
thing.
but,
Yes,
but the longer that I worked on the idea, the more I was like, you know, I don't really think that that fits. You know, evolution's kind of an arbitrary process. You know, it's not. You know, this wasn't arbitrary at all. The reason that, you know, NSW transformed into what it ultimately transformed into was very deliberate. So the title was inappropriate. So I just kind of I was really frustrated. Like I kind of went back to the drawing board, and whenever I got stuck with a paragraph or a sentence or something like that, I would either go for a run or go for a walk or something like that. And through walking or through running, I would usually come up with the answer to the problem. And it didn't work. It was, I went through 2 weeks of runs and walks and everything like that. And I had no idea. Ultimately, I had to come back to, you know, the most important question that any writer asks of what they've worked on or spent the last 10 years working on is, what is this book? And ultimately, the answer was, well, this is an underdog story. It's a story that should never have happened. And, you know, growing up, I had, you know, great grandfather, great dad, and they both, you know, told me all these great, you know, stories of, you know, history. And one of the for whatever reason, like one of the first underdog stories that popped into my head was the story of, you know, crusaders sneaking in, you know, to a castle, you know, through the aqueduct. And I knew this story, and you know, I'm a very slow reader, very slow writer, but for whatever reason, this that little epigram was probably the fastest thing I've ever written.
Nice.
Oh yeah, and it was just, once I wrote it, and once I got to the end of that, you know, it ended with "By Water Beneath the Walls," and I was like, oh my God, that's the title.
Yeah, love it. Let's end there, man. Hey, thanks so much for coming on and speaking with me on this, and thank you for writing this. I mean,
thanks, Chris.
Like, it's such an important book, and you know, even if you're not associated with naval special warfare or anything like that, like you said, I mean, much respect and love to all the branches of service out there, all the units out there. There's successes and failures across the board throughout this history and every other history out there. And what's important is that we understand that and learn from it, right? So that we can be better moving forward. So it's a really important piece of work. I can't remember the last time I read a 500-page book, but I thoroughly enjoyed it, man. And I feel better for having done it, you know, and it's, again, because of our organization and knowing that history. So I do think that it should be some kind of required reading out there for guys in the pipeline, because you know, we need to know this stuff. So the last thing is it's not lost on me that it's like late on a Friday right before Christmas, and you know, I'm sure you have better things to be doing. So I appreciate you coming on, man.
I'm delighted. I'll never turn down an opportunity to talk about this history or the guys that made it. So thank you so much for the opportunity, and thanks to everybody who's, you know, given to this organization, and thanks for all the work that you guys do for the community. So I'm honored to be here. So thanks.
Awesome. Thanks for listening to On the X, the official podcast of the Navy SEAL Foundation and an Ironclad original series sponsored by Mechanics Wear. You can learn more about Ben at benhmilligan.com and the foundation at navysealfoundation.org. You can also text the word On the X to 60104 to join our text subscriber list. See you next time.